right, everyone. We're here. We're very excited to have Russellbrand here for our first new episode of the Illusion of Consensus podcast revamp, Illusion of Consensus 2.0. Our podcast has been massively growing over the past year on Substack and Spotify, Apple, and all other platforms. So we've decided to revamp the show with a wonderful production company. And for our first episode, we were thinking of who to have on. And the first name that came to mind was Russellbrand. So very excited to have him on. Russell, thanks for being here. And Jay, I'm excited for this new season of the show.
It's wonderful to be here, Rav, with on this Illusion of Consensus podcast. And Russell, so grateful to you for joining us and agreeing to join us. Been wanting to talk to you ever since the last conversation we had. There was so much that was brought up, and so much that's happened to you since then. And it's, I think, going to be an exciting conversation.
Excited to communicate with you from our first conversation, and right to the second. I felt like there's such a kind of radiant integrity and warmth that comes from you, not only when speaking about the subjects upon which you are definitively an expert, but also how you've explained how you've been impacted by the consequences of speaking out truthfully during a time of considerable censorship and what appears to have been, vendetta journalism, for example. And Rav, you're just such a brilliant and a young writer and such a great contributor to this space, already making great waves and scoops. So I'm thrilled to be here with both of you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it, Russell. So we got some interesting questions here that I was drafting last night. There's an infinite amount of topics we could talk about, ranging from religious and spiritual to political and scientific. I thought I'd just start us off in a kind of unconventional way. But I thought it would be interesting. Like, I feel like, Russell, you embody the word transformation for a lot of people. And I've been following you for a while, and that's actually why I got interested in your work a few years ago, not because of your political views, but because of your story, and where you were a few years ago with Hollywood, drug addiction, sex addiction, all these things in the past, and how you overcame them through AA, through spiritual grounding, learning about different religious systems, practicing meditation, connecting with God, etc. I thought, first question, like, if you were to go back to, let's say, we can pick wherever, but let's say if we go back to like senior year of high school, like grade 12, and like if you put yourself in your senior year of high school's shoes and you look to the future, to where you are now, how do you feel? Because it's been like, did you ever anticipate anything like this? What kind of emotions come up when you think about where you were and your humble beginnings to now what you've become as this big countercultural, spiritual, media icon that's now greatly informing and influencing the discourse?
Well, I've been through, as you alluded to, Rav, a good many incarnations, and I wish I could claim some kind of independent authorship or even moral or spiritual authority. But the truth is that with every transformation that's taken place in my life, I've found myself on my knees at the point of the barrel of a gun. The reason I stopped drinking and taking drugs is because I have a desperate and dreadful fear of the consequences, as well as perhaps now in hindsight, a thin silvery thread of hope, barely detectable on the outlines, on the storms of the life I was living then. The various other changes that I've made around hedonism and consuming and materialism and attachment and all of the many consequences of rationalism that are normalized throughout our culture, and we're all like American and Canadian and English, and I think we're sort of broadly umbrellaed by the same culture, even though between us there are different ages. You're considerably younger, Rav, and I'm sure there are different cultural influences, and at least one of us is a very highly educated scientist. Me, I taught myself science, and that's why I've always had the inside track on pathogens and epidemiology.
That's what I thought.
Self-taught.
I knew it from the beginning,
I learned my epidemiology on the streets. Hard hip-hop epidemiology. And so one of the things I feel is interesting is that seldom are our identities formed in solitude. Our identities are based on a set of relationships, and those can be familial or social or educational. And what we have at the moment through social media is the potential to create almost fully immersive, ubiquitous environments that completely control the information we have access to, and are increasingly, it seems, interested in confining and controlling the information that we most definitely do not have access to. When I look at my little life, it was just a series of cliches, really. Drug addict, comedian, womanizing, hedonist. These are all tropes, borderline cliches. But I'm very lucky that having an understanding of addiction meant that you get a kind of Western, somewhat Christian, pseudo-Jungian understanding of attachment and materialism. And even beyond that, the tendency to default to, if you live in a culture like I grew up in, the idea that you are your own God, that you are God, really. They may not explicitly tell you you're God, but they sure as hell have slogans like, because you're worth it, and just do it. And increasingly, the normalization of self-satisfaction and individualism as the summit of our shared and individual experience is generating numerous problems throughout the culture, throughout the world, but does have the benefit of making people highly, highly, highly malleable. If all someone cares about is themselves and what they want, they're essentially a very manageable little node. You can control them with fear and desire. The minute someone believes in a purpose beyond themselves, they become a volatile element. And I think that that's perhaps why the culture tries to create people that are selfish and individualistic and materialistic and don't believe in different planes of being. And before anyone thinks that's a little too woo-woo, having any ethical or moral position is an allusion to a different plane of being, because rationally and materially, all you can demonstrate are the primal and biological requirements for sustenance, survival, procreation, and a decent position in a hierarchy. So, look, what I would say is, the message I would render would not just be to little 16-year-old high school Russell, but, because I have young children now. I've got a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old and a little son who's 9 months, getting on for 10 months old. And when I'm looking at the default education system, what is normalized, what is considered to be important, what are considered to be values and principles worth pursuing, I recognize, and even actually more practically than that, wouldn't you want your children to be raised to understand nature, to understand the cosmos, to understand their own bodies, to understand morality, to understand survival, to then maybe culture and arts? Of course, those things are fascinating and what we might consider rudimentary, even though that word probably needs to be unpacked a little, educational skills around arithmetic, or literacy and arithmetic. We have created some narrow lines to exist within, and I can see who benefits from our consciousness and our intentions remaining within these lines. So I'm very lucky that I was a pretty severe drug addict and pretty hopeless hedonist, because it's led me to a place of understanding.
Russell, there's so much there that's amazing to hear. I have to say that you live that path out in public, which probably, I can only imagine, must have made it that much harder to have that transformation with everybody watching you. But that is, to me, I never had that hedonism in the same sense. I never had the drug addicts. I never had the womanizing. But that path that you just described, I feel is incredibly familiar. In the academic life, the temptation isn't toward those things. It's towards something even worse, even more insidious. You're going to be famous. You're going to live forever in your ideas. People will look up to you as if you're smart. And that is a trap, is what I discovered in my life. That the idea that I can, through just my raw intellect, become somebody that everyone looks up to, that's the summit of being. That is a lie, actually. And what it actually ends up doing is it traps you from being able to become who you're really supposed to be, to really discover what science is supposed to be about, to really to say things that people disagree with. It leads to a conformity in academics that undermines your individuality, undermines your potential. And in fact, I think it was a central problem during the pandemic that so many scientists and academics were so concerned about what other people, their fellow scientists, were thinking of them, that they stayed silent even as great evil happened in the world. And so that path that you just described, where you understood that the things that you were entrapped by were entrapping you, that you shed them, that you and of course you and I are Christian. We look to God for that purpose. I agree with you. You praised and thanked that you had that experience of being trapped. I also do that, but I'm also glad to be out on the other side of it, Russell.
Very much so.
You
and
are.
To your point about, I believe, integrity as well as humility, two of the principles that the aspiration of which appears to have been obfuscated within the profession or field, at least, within which you've made your reputation. I feel that, isn't it extraordinary now that we have AstraZeneca withdrawing their vaccine and claiming it's for commercial reasons when they've had to legally acknowledge that it causes blood clots? Isn't it extraordinary that Pfizer are settling cancer cases out of court, albeit not for vaccine medication, but for an acid reflux medication? Isn't it astonishing to see excess death statistics being manipulated and maneuvered? I'm staggered to see sort of Chris Cuomo, who, and again, as I say on the few occasions where I've mentioned this, it's not a person I'm seeking as an individual. As he himself said, he was living in an environment where it was required to have a very particular mentality. But to see someone who participated so actively in the condemnation of ivermectin, and notably Joe Rogan for using it, just say, I use that now and I'm vaccine injured. It only a kind of hysterical institutional amnesia can prevent surely a wide-scale reckoning and awakening around what happened in the last 3 years. I can sense that there's an attempt to almost pack this away with JFK into a box marked long time ago. Don't think about it. If you start pulling that thread, the entire tapestry of our culture is going to come undone. But that's precisely the reason why that thread should be pulled. The nature of Anthony Fauci's relationship with DARPA, the degree to which he was across projects that were military as well as medical from as early as 2002, the fact that the NIH earn royalties, the fact that the FDA are funded by the pharmaceutical industry, the fact that legacy media is funded to the degree that it is by Big Pharma, or that it's creaking observably. It seems to me that in the audaciousness of this gambit, this attempt to facilitate and expedite, and this is of course conjecture, this part, the ability to centralize authority via is seemingly innocuous, forgive the word, bureaucracies like the WHO, NATO, the IMF, the UN, to legitimize further centralized and undemocratic sovereignty superseding centralization via this pandemic has led to great inquiry and great understanding that will only be able to be neutered and opposed if indeed they are able to impose the kind of censorship that is being discussed daily around the world, usually in order to, inverted commas, protect people from misinformation and malinformation. And the fact is that it seems to me that you, Jay, and you, Rav, as a journalist, and you, Jay, as a scientist, simply pursued what you understood to be true in spite of external forces. And all of us, to one degree or another, have seen what the consequences for those kind of choices are, and the power of the machine, but also, blessedly, its ineptitude.
I mean, the central thing is hubris, right? The thing that drove the entire structure is we have control over how every pathogen spreads. We have the power to develop miracle cures. We have the power to, and all that's required is that you obey us, you listen to us, that you put yourself under us, and then that will solve all the central problems you have, which is really the fear of death. And I think that like the AstraZeneca thing is so interesting. Yeah, commercial. They are pulling it because they can't sell any of the vaccines, but they can't sell any more of the vaccines because people started to understand there were side effects. B, people started to understand that if you've had COVID and recovered, the marginal benefit from the vaccine is almost very negligible. Your immunity provides better protection than the vaccine.
Hi everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual, but it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal mental and physical health and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed generalized kind of medical advice, and less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of a general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word Illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For the subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word Illusion, and you can get your discount and you won't regret it. All right, back to the show.
And so it's not just that the commercial it's commercially non-viable because there's anti-vaxxers floating around saying that you don't need it. It's commercially non-viable because of reality, the reality of side effects, the reality of the low efficacy. The hubris essentially gets punctured by the reality. And the censorship you brought up, that's a desperate last stand in order to maintain power in the context of a collapse in the face of reality.
Absolutely. A desperate last stand is a phrase that I'm writing down because it seems so accurate and all-encompassing. That does feel like what we are experiencing. And as you said, hubris seems to be a determinant, as well as the fear of death. I did read something sort of spectacular near the beginning of the COVID pandemic, which did indeed shape my perspective of it. It was, I'm blanking on the name at the moment, but it will come to me. Charles Eisenstein, is that right? Charles Eisenstein talked about the coronavirus and the literal meaning of the coronavirus. And he talked about what was being revealed. And this was sort of prior to the advent of the vaccines, and probably came at a period where, unless you understood epidemiology and the nature of, what they say, clusters and ripples and how pathogens tend to spread, a lockdown would seem like a sensible solution if you didn't know which groups were most vulnerable and how what the likely consequences were. And he said that what is undergirding this really is a sort of a terrible amount of fear. And the first thing, perhaps, the first hook that caused me to contemplate and even question and ultimately reject what was happening is I know that the undergirding principle of our society is not we must protect the vulnerable, and any sacrifice that we must make in order to protect the vulnerable is worth making. As soon as I hear politicians, lawmakers who I know ultimately are dominated by a donor class, financial interest, corporatist, globalist entities that may have interests beyond dominion and finance, but certainly you can corroborate that they are motivated at least by those factors. I began to think this does not make sense. There were sort of extraordinary, observable, and somewhat amusing inconsistencies to the way that homeless people in my country, as I'm sure in yours too, were like temporarily housed as if like some Christian awakening had taken place. Wait a minute, we shouldn't be allowing people to be poor and destitute. Let's see if we can take care of people. And why don't we be loving and kind to our elderly? And shouldn't children really be being raised by whole communities? And mustn't we value the role of the mother? And shouldn't we all be like hold on a minute, this doesn't make sense. This isn't how we live. Why are we all pretending that we live on a set of spiritual principles? We live in a merciless, individualistic, cruel, controlling, distracting, dishonest culture. Whether it's deliberate or inadvertent, I'm not in a position to say. Yeah. But what I do not believe is that your key motivation is protect the vulnerable, because the vulnerable, it seems, are there to be exploited, whether that's kids mining in Congo or homeless people just strewn upon our streets. The whole system is geared towards exploitation. Exploitation is a synonym for the type of crony capitalism that operates as the central force of our economy and therefore our power systems.
Yeah, I almost feel grateful, Russell, in a kind of perverse, dark way, that we were exposed to such corruption on such a explicit authoritarian level, where politicians and lawmakers were lying and misleading and deceiving us. It's almost like a weird bit of gratitude that I have of like, okay, now we got to really see what's going on behind the scenes. Previously, we had just taken FDA, CDC, NIH recommendations to be just obviously true, and anyone who disagrees is this anti-vaxxer quack. But now it's like, oh, okay, this is what's really going on behind the scenes, and it's like this real world education in authoritarianism. I do want to take a step back here and just like ask you, Russell, like what was the impetus for you? I think like early on, like I started watching your monologues on COVID. Were those your first few major monologues that you were doing? And what was the impetus for that? Was it the start of the vaccine mandates or earlier on, or were you doing the bigger monologues before that? Because before that, the work of yours that I was following was primarily on addiction and spiritual recovery and meditation, mindfulness, and things like that. And then I started watching these incredible, jocular, playful, but hard-hitting monologues that you were doing on YouTube, which were, obviously just so powerful and hitting such incredible traction across global audiences.
As a stand-up comedian, which is a very direct way of dealing with content, biographical and cultural, me or any comedian, I reckon, is probably continually evolving the subjects they're tackling. And because, when I would say famous and doing movies and things like that, if you see my stand-up shows from that time, I'll be talking about promiscuity, meeting famous people. But there'll always be the sort of idea underneath it that, this isn't working. There's something, this isn't who I really am. This isn't what I really want. I'm looking for something. then, like, as I sort of grew and got married, and I started to do comedy as anyone would. I'm not sort of suggesting this is anything other than absolutely ordinary. Started to do comedy about having a family and about what it's like to be present for the birth of your first child and what it's like to raise a child and what it's like to go on holiday with kids, standard fare, stand-up comedy subjects. And as media has altered and, I was working for mainstream legacy media institutions, whether that's Hollywood studios, US TV networks, British TV networks. I was just due to an accident of, the period where I was born and making content, been making podcasts and stuff. I was probably doing podcasts in like 2006, maybe, because when I was on radio, they would make a podcast of the radio show, and this was the period where people were noticing, hey, more people are listening to this as a podcast than they are of radio. People probably somewhere within those institutions were like, we're in a lot of trouble. Our media model is not going to work anymore because people can go directly to the audience. This whole thing is going to collapse. Probably those conversations were being had. Certainly they're being had now. So while I was, I think, oh God, I don't know what I was doing. Was I making a film? Maybe. I might have been doing Death on the Nile. Maybe that was the last movie I did. I was doing like online content where I would talk about addiction. I've written books about addiction. I've, tried to use the material of my life and the errors of my life as sort of content for the work that I do. And then this extraordinary seismic global event occurred. And I obviously talked about that. I was in Australia when it happened. I was making pretty regular social media content. I was touring. I was in Australia doing stand-up comedy. That's why I was there doing stand-up. And I was coming home to do touring in the UK. I was planning to go to the United States and Canada to do stand-up comedy. All this stuff was cancelled and necessarily, actually, in retrospect,
Yeah. By the way, Russell, I remember reading your audiobook, and I think was it you said that you were about to do like ayahuasca or something? You had some like plans for what to do, and then it all disrupted that, and then you went back home and had to change your plans.
No one that knows me is ever going to let me take ayahuasca. Let me tell you, there are so many barriers in my life to legitimizing psychedelic voyages of discovery, whether they are liturgical or based on abstemiousness, temporal. No one will let me do that stuff. Let me tell you. But what subsequently,
I listened to that part of the book, and I was laughing when I heard you talk about that. You were like, I'm about to plunge myself into this spiritual realm of ayahuasca, but then so the pandemic comes in, and then
if that's what it takes, if it takes a world being locked down to keep me from meeting the mother ayahuasca, then I have to take destiny and I'll take those lessons. But so what happened? Then I started working again with someone I've always done my sort of stand up with, or my TV shows. The man that produces my stand-up shows and produced a lot of my radio content and has worked on sort of films with me, Gareth Roy, who sort of works here now. I said, this, let's make more news-oriented content. Let's go. And we, in fact, did the Trues. We did years ago. We prolonged, but God, the videos will still be up on YouTube. Presumably, I don't know what gets taken down these days, but we used to just make content, attacking Fox News then was the sort of more of a sort of a legitimate target for that kind of ire, and reading British print media, and we organised campaigns, and I got into a whole lot of trouble for saying that democracy doesn't work, and that most of the people I grew up with don't vote because it's pointless, and we're you're going to end up with one of two co-opted parties. Anyway, so we started just doing more of these videos, and we realized we didn't need any brokerage, and that's what was amazing. It's we can just make this stuff. And that I believe is probably more important than whatever, because you'll notice that the news story that requires censorship shifts continuously. 1 minute it's related to geopolitics, 1 minute it's related to military activity, 1 minute it's related to a health crisis, the next minute it's related to some cultural issue. So what's really important is not the subject, but is the ability to censor. And usually what's being used to legitimize censorship is safety, protection. Convenience is sometimes used to make us, more compliant when it comes to should we centralize all of our financial and digital data. But This is the rise of independent media, and how independent media will inevitably intersect with politics and start to direct power is pretty obvious. And it's been obvious from Napster that it can collapse entire industries. It's been obvious in the Arab Spring that it can organize political movements. The rise of Trump, Brexit, now more recent examples, figures like RFK or Vivek Ramaswamy. This is a serious, serious problem, and they are looking to control it with, and now I have evidence of that due to Freedom of Information Act requests that sort of show the degree to which this kind of podcast is being monitored and controlled. And Jay Bhattacharya, that's a name that comes up. If you start doing Freedom of Information Act, they say, these are the people you have to censor, get these people off social media. My name's on those lists, Jay's is. Rav, you've got that to look forward to.
The funny thing, Russell, is that I had always thought of comedians as much more dangerous than scientists, because you can say whatever you like, and you have access to the sort of the hindbrains of people, where you really can move them. In fact, that's generally the power of art over the that it has over the sciences. It has this power to move people in fundamental areas where they don't have any defenses. Whereas science, it's your rational centers, all your defenses are up. But it was striking that when the scientists and public health authorities said, "Oh, look, here are the essential activities, and here are the non-essential activities," and art was included among the non-essential activities. Religious worship included among the non-essential activities. Artists didn't speak up generally. I mean, Russell, you were an exception. So many artists basically said, "Yes, we're non-essential." So many religious people, churches, said, yes, we're non-essential. They essentially assented to the idea that these such fundamental basic activities that are so, they're more important than science in the sense that they touch us where we can't be, where we have no defenses, where we care the most. People just said, okay, we're not that essential anymore when the scientists said so. And so I started to change my idea about who had the power, Russell. I don't know. I would like to have the power flip back the other direction.
I think that's very revealing, and it tells you, in a way, what's perhaps happening epocally is the recognition that there are ways to disrupt the usual lines of communication and control. Even the category of artist is one that, in my case, was kind of pursued. Like, when I think, would you invent the entire profession of the movie industry if it didn't exist in order to fulfill some nascent and burgeoning yearning within you? Or is it really that you just want to communicate? You just want to create? An institution, a set of institutions, and an industry exists, and if you have a certain skill set, you're sucked into it. And then once you're into it, you recognize that remaining within it is going to require various degrees of compliance. They have their own sets, their own hermeneutics, they have their own order. And actually, really, why would the entertainment industry be the thing that sucks up people that ultimately want to be communicators and creators? And it is indeed, I would say, a byproduct of the flaws within secularism, even as a notion, that lead us to this kind of individualism and materialism that ultimately becomes an economic and commercial endeavor rather than anyone else. What is a successful actor? What is a successful comedian? Like, God, I can't even stop myself from looking at these things in commercial and economic terms. Someone told me not long ago, that they stayed in a South France holiday chateau, and like within the inbuilt wardrobe, Francis Bacon, the artist, had stayed there and had scratched in a razor blade some kind of portrait or rendering, or whatever. I was like, oh my God, that's so amazing, because it's like you've got a Francis Bacon sort of like on the wall. This is better than a Banksy. And I noticed myself, like, I couldn't like resist. Oh, what's it worth? What's it worth? Like that's how it's in. And like, and what we are all of us asking, well, what's it worth, this talent I've got? We put it to work, we prostitute it. What can I get out of this sort of this inborn thing I have to communicate or show off, in my case? And we all have our own various abilities to offer. And actually, had I, to your point in your question earlier, Rav, about, what would you tell your younger self? It's find the spiritual path. and whatever you have, use it in the service of God. But, good luck finding that path, because it has been, it's got asphalt all over it, and it's like an airport of commodity now, and you can't find the way home.
Russell, can I mount a defense of your industry just for a second? I mean, the thing is we are people that need stories. We respond to stories. That's what that industry is about. That's what your industry is about. In fact, even that's what science is about. We are beings that require good stories, and when things are working well, that's what your industry provides. That's what science provides. When we have incentives and institutions that get in the way of that, that's the problem. Our institutions should create incentives for us to tell each other good stories.
But as science has become a subset of economic and commercial interest, meaning that clinical trials that will not ultimately be profitable in one way or another, normally the most obvious way, the entertainment industry has become a subset of economic and commercial interest, meaning that stories, although I am astonished that you can make a film like The Matrix, for example, that says, hey, you've all been imprisoned in little cells and an illusion's being pumped into your brain. Wake up, you're in a simulation. Wake up immediately. And people just will watch it, enjoy it, and actually understand it, and then carry on, instead of forming small cells of revolutionary dissent.
Yeah. It's been so interesting to see the political landscape evolve over the past couple of years, with various alliances being created and various factions coming together. And, we're having a conversation right now, us three people, like all of this feels so crazy if you kind of zoom out and really look at what's going on. Like me talking to an epidemiologist, us doing a podcast with russellbrand, one of my personal heroes since high school. It's like this has all been created due to the authoritarian power, and then people who are curious and want to find the truth, no matter if it hurts them politically or socially, or whether it attracts a left-wing audience or a right-wing audience. I think all of us here share that value of finding the truth at all costs. I think Jay has paid a pretty heavy price of that. So have you, Russell. I have to a lesser degree. And one interesting thing that I was thinking about yesterday, Russell, in preparation for this interview, is how when I watched you, Russell, a few years ago, and you were mentioning earlier about how your previous political expressions in the past, like a decade and a half ago, very much opposing kind of right-wing authoritarianism, criticizing Fox News. 2015, I watched your conversation with Sam Harris, and you guys at that point were talking about different cultural values, and you guys brought up the topic of Islam, which was a big topic for Sam early on in his career, and about how should we be able to criticize sort of other cultures which, let's say, suppress women's rights, gay rights, don't allow people to express themselves, and don't have political equality between genders, and etc. And all the kind of cultural and religious values around that. And you were very much criticizing Sam at the time, saying that, like, who am I as a white guy in a Western world to be able to criticize how Afghanistan, runs their society and what rights they give women and minorities, etc. And I remember thinking, like, I really disagree with that at the time. Like, I sided on Sam's perspective on that particular issue, about that we should have some kind of unifying universal ethic, right? We should be able to criticize, this society versus our society. What are some principles that we can, gather around and share and, express our own individual rights and values in a collective society. But fast forward now, like watching you over the past couple of years, it's like I'm curious where you've kind of migrated, in your views, but like seeing you at that point to now, where certain people you were debating at the time, they've kind of become more unreasonable on certain topics, and you've now become the shining voice of reason when it comes to challenging big pharma, when it comes to challenging government corporations, etc. I guess I'm just curious, Russell, how you feel like you may or may not have evolved in your views at the time, what you were talking about when it comes to shared cultural values and being able to, criticize the way other societies are run versus ours, and trying to find
That's
something
interesting.
universal.
Because even the concept of the universal is one that's sort of under attack and has been, I suppose, from the advent, or perhaps from the Enlightenment onwards, but certainly from post-structuralism and post-modernity onwards. I would still say that Western military interests have no business being in Afghanistan, and whatever that business was, it wasn't about women's rights. I would sort of, I'd maintain that interest. I'd probably take Julian Assange's analysis that $2 trillion was extracted out of the American taxpayers' economy, and very little was achieved, and even the withdrawal was botched. And the Mexican nationalist movement are fond of saying, we didn't cross the line, the line crossed us. And I feel that authoritarianism became so sort of ubiquitous and normalized, often through the bogus claim that it's in order to protect the vulnerable, whether that's authoritarianism during the pandemic to protect the vulnerable, or censorship now to protect the vulnerable. I don't think that they are concerned about protecting the vulnerable. I think they're concerned about legitimizing authority. And a good way to legitimize authority is protecting the vulnerable, helping people, convenience, safety. Now, there's no doubt that I've evolved, and I certainly don't think that it's a great claim to make that, I think the same things that I thought when I was 14, I'm changing all of the time. But I suppose if there has been a significant change, it's probably almost this one. I wonder if, where possible, we might, and this is, certainly Jay is better qualified to answer this than me. I wonder if you were to look for a guide for how systems of government and principles to guide how we might live could be drawn up, is there any use in, as best we can, understanding how human beings may have lived, or indeed can demonstrably lived, for thousands of years, in the same way that we might with a simple subject like dietary requirements recognize that whether you want to eat meat or not eat meat, I think most people would agree that eating a significant amount of hard to access food like sugar might have difficult consequences, because the way that those plants and our bodies evolved, and believing in evolution for me is not does not undermine my faith in a heavenly creator or father. Incidentally, just tracking the method does not mean that there was not a creator. So I wonder if we take the diet as a sort of an analogy, or at least a sort of a principle, that I wonder if the way that how larger groups we live in, the way that we communicate, the very simple fact that very different tribes might live differently on the basis of their environment and whatever totems and taboos have grown up out of their culture. The principle of decentralization, the principle of localism, the principle of unity but decentralization, I think is a vital one. I feel that from the point of agriculture onwards, centralizing systems of power have been promising and to a degree delivering, but post-industrialization and now post-technologization, I feel that what's happened is vast amounts of power have been created and are wielded. And whilst there is no doubt, because I can almost hear the materialist riposte that, there are less people living on $1 a day than ever before, and less people that are malnourished, and there are more calories than we're ever going to need, even if those calories all come via Walmart, and 70% of the global calories are now consumed through processed foods. I wonder if a way that if we are to approach something like the universal, let's recognize that it's really the terrestrial, it's the way that human beings tend to live on this planet. Perhaps that is something that we might use. And so, I wouldn't claim to tell someone in South Carolina how they should believe or how they should eat or how they should raise their children. Nor would I tell someone in Manhattan the same thing, or somebody in Uganda or Sweden or anywhere. I would say the maximum amount, end these arguments, end these debates by saying the maximum amount of democracy possible. At what point do we intervene? Is it right to intervene when people are being violent or imposing upon people's individual and personal freedoms? I suppose, yes, it is. So I guess, at some point there has to be some universal set of principles around violence, intrusion, exploitation. Of course there is, but I'm saying there's a lot less freedom than there could be, a lot more bureaucracy than there could be, and power now is maneuvering not in plain sight, adorned with medals and red and white badges. It's become Kafkaesque, mercurial and insidious, a creeping bureaucratic fog as we sit back and sip on Huxley's Soma while simultaneously receiving Orwell's boot right to the face. So it's bureaucracy that terrifies me more.
Yeah. Okay, Russell, we only have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to ask one more question, which Jay and I are both interested in, which is about your religious conversion, and then we'll give you 3 quick sort of rapid-fire questions from our exclusive members. So when it comes to your conversion, Russell, I guess to summarize the question, I'm just very curious because I was on your show a couple months ago, January and October, and I've been watching your work for a long time. And I'll just honestly say, even though I don't really talk about this on the podcast or much on illusion of consensus because it's not relevant, but your sort of explorations in kind of different religious systems from Hinduism, Buddhism to Christianity, and sort of appealing to kind of Aldous Huxley's perennial truths model significantly impacted me over the past few years. And I think you've been a powerful communicator of some of those ideas. And we talked a bit about that in October, and we were kind of indulging for a few minutes our mutual interest in Eastern mysticism and meditation, which is something I'm interested in. I guess I'm curious with your religious conversion. Is it actually like, have you changed your views or your like fundamental theology over the past like even few months? Because we were kind of having, we were talking about the Eastern mystical stuff, or was your religious conversion kind of a symbolic signifier of something you already like believed, but it was just something symbolic? So I'm curious, if you can explain that in a couple minutes.
Of course, I can understand the entire Christian doctrine in a couple of minutes. I mean, like easily. But to sort of answer what seems to be the main thrust of your question. Of course, I am interested in the various ways that people tackle the idea of living and the idea of dying. I'm from Grays and Essex in Essex. I'm a English person, you're aware of Jesus in a number of sort of extraordinarily parochial ways. Jesus is everywhere, but I don't know what happened to me. But it might be this is out of Corinthians, and he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." I have somehow discovered and felt that when I've talked extensively and openly about it is the self that you must overcome, somehow I didn't see that was in Christianity. I didn't see that the message of Christ, pick up your cross and follow me. Somehow the idea that I would surrender to something like Christianity, feel like it's maybe might exclude other people, maybe might exclude myself. Through suffering, I've been shown a different truth. Suffering that goes beyond, of course, people will make assumptions based on what they know. God, what else would people do but make assumptions based on what they know? People will be aware that I've been publicly attacked. Blessedly, a significant number of people recognize what the undergirding idea behind that might actually be. People might not be aware, although I know that Jay is, that during that same period, my son was undergoing heart surgery in the famous Great Ormond Street Hospital. And, I'm lucky that I have access to some pretty amazing people. And I came to understand this is not happening to you. This is happening for you. And the figure of Jesus Christ, who's tattooed on my body, who's been tattooed on my body for a long time now, the principles, the glamour, the glory of Christ, all of these things that somehow seemed abstract, all sort of struck me in the weakness and vulnerability and suffering and hopelessness. So no, whilst baptism has a symbolic component, I'll tell you, unlike anything I've experienced before, and I've experienced a lot of, substances that are designed to alter your state, it induced an altering of my state. Now, anyone that is already Christian will know that I'm not making any claims of perfection. In the just over a week, since I've been baptized, I've like had tough times with my kids. I've had tough times at work. Some new frequency, something has happened, and people can like, look, whatever you do, if you're in the public eye, people are going to say it's a grift. People are going to say it's a shield. You'll get that stuff. It's a marker of your impact in a way. But I I know that if they could stop you doing it, if they could stop you going to Christ, they would stop you going to Christ, because I believe and I understand there is dark power in some high places, that we are not dealing just with principalities of flesh. We are dealing with darkness, man. And this baptism and the journey towards it has been phenomenal and real. And it's very, very new, but it's not like a gesture. It's like I surrender. I accept Jesus Christ. It's thankfully I feel great relief. Of course I feel trepidation. Of course I feel vulnerable, but I feel held.
Russell, that's a beautiful story. That's with lots and lots of details. Different. My story too. And it's a long journey, but it's a long journey in the right direction. You turn around. You're not perfect, but it's you have help. You accept that you're weak, but you have help. That's the Christian journey.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that was really beautifully put, Russell. I would love to talk to you about that for another 3 hours, and I'm sure we will one day. But I'll give you 3 rapid fire questions from our members, and you can answer it however quickly you want. How do you manage stress? Any exercises, tips, or things that you do? Thoughts on the Kendrick Lamar Drake beef, their hip hop beef? And thirdly, when you were a young kid in school, were you the one always asking the questions or the one shooting the spitballs? So first on stress.
My daily routine is I go in cold water. I pray the rosary. I pray on my knees. And I pray to hear God's will in my life that day. I do the way that I deal with stress is I accept its inevitability, and I try to marshal my life through a series of ongoing rituals. And I belong to communities of mutual support, and I'm investigating church life. I'm doing whatever I can, because stress, I suppose, is resistance and tension. Like it means I'm in a state of resistance and tension, and I don't want to live in that anymore. I want to walk the spiritual path. I don't want to live in stress. I don't want to. I see it as probably an indication that I'm still too worldly, still too wedded and embedded in systems I don't understand. And other things I don't understand are the beef between Drake and Kendrick Lamar, because I don't follow hip hop closely enough anymore to understand what's happening there. But I'm of an age where it's Blur and Oasis, or maybe the Stones and the Beatles at a push. But Kendrick Lamar and Drake, I pray for, or even Tupac and Tupac and Suge Knight. But I pray for East Coast, West Coast, Kendrick, Drake, peaceful solution, and I pray that both of them can find forgiveness in their hearts. And what's the third one, mate?
Yeah, and just a quick follow up on the first one. I'm just curious, do you still have like a meditative practice that you follow? And then the third question is, were you the one in the class throwing the spitballs, or the one asking the interesting, curious questions?
The chanting of the rosary is my meditative practice now. But I feel like I probably need more silence, and maybe I'll look into that. I know contemplation and silence is available to me within my new faith.
Yeah, your meditation podcast, by the way, a couple years ago was really good. For people who don't know, Russell did a whole series where he's doing guided meditations every week. I was listening every week, and you answered one of my questions.
That's amazing.
We'll talk about them.
Beautiful. I still do a weekly meditation, by the way. Why don't I do some promo? I do weekly meditation on Locals. My membership community has a weekly book club where we're reading Mere Christianity. We meditate every single week, a guided meditation. And we do exclusive content. So there's a little bit of promo right there at the end. And you'd like. We'll send you a link for free, and you too, Jay, and also for 2 of your listeners or your community. We'll sort those links out for you. And what was the other thing? the other thing.
Sure.
Oh man, I
Spitballs.
was,
In class, were you the one
I was an
shooting the
amorphous
spitballs?
little creature even then. Sometimes I was sort of a, devil-may-care joker. Other times I was dreadfully fraught and quiet. All I can remember is once or twice in English classes feeling a temporary relief from the general sense that I was a fool and unlovable when some linguistic trick would garner me 5 minutes of attention, some casual piece of alliteration or assonance or dissonance would help me out. So like I did a bit of both the spitballing and the mischief. Thanks, you lot.
All right. That's awesome. Well, Russell, thanks so much for coming on. I'll just say it, I'll just fanboy a little bit. You're my personal hero for many years, a spiritual hero, someone who I've looked up to for a long time in aiding my own journey towards spiritual recovery and understanding myself and healing various parts of brokenness. I've really looked up to you for a long time. So thank you so much for joining us. And Jay, I'm glad we did this with Russell. This has been fantastic. And thank you to the Illusion of Consensus community for allowing us to do this and taking interest. I'm really excited to release this episode and get this new season of the podcast
Thank you for
rolling.
including me, both of you. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Russell.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.